I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 16906 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about Operation Tailwind. That was one of those hairy missions the Special Forces in the Montagnards would go on over in the Kingdom of Laos. They had an organization over there in Vietnam called Command and Control Areas. They had Command and Control North, Central, and in the Southern regions. These were Special Forces operations called the SOG. That stood for Studies and Observations Group. That means they would go out and check things out in areas nobody else would want to go. Operation Tailwind was a very interesting operation. The Special Forces guys with their Montagnard cohorts went further into Laos than any Americans had ever been on the ground. The force that went out there consisted of 16 Americans and 110 Montagnards. Amazingly, their casualties were quite low. Unfortunately, 3 of the Montagnards were killed. All the Americans were wounded, but they made it back safely. The medic that was with them, who took care of all these wounded, eventually received the Medal of Honor. Another interesting thing about Operation Tailwind was that CNN got involved in it, and what they did with Operation Tailwind verifies the idea that most people have that you should not believe a word you hear from CNN. Apparently, they are a corrupt organization, as demonstrated by what they did when they reported on Operation Tailwind. I'm going to share a story that appeared in Wikipedia that talks about the operation, what the Americans and the Montagnards did out there, and the CNN's report on the story and the aftermath of that. I think you'll find it very interesting. Another reason I was interested in this story is because I used to fly missions with CCN up out of Quang Tri. The Special Forces guys were sort of unusual, and you did not want to mess with them. They looked like they could hurt you really bad if you did something to them, so we gave them a wide berth. We would support them as they would go out on these missions in places that we weren't allowed to say where we went. Keep in mind, we were up near the DMZ and the Laotian border. That should give you a few hints about where we were going. Enough about that. Let's take a look at this story about Operation Tailwind that appeared on Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. Who needs Britannica? We've got Wikipedia. Let's take a look at this story about Operation Tailwind. Dateline, Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia website. Operation Tailwind was a covert incursion by a small unit of United States Army and allied Montagnard forces into southeastern Laos during the Vietnam War, conducted between September the 11th through the 14th, 1970. Its purpose was to create a diversion for a Royal Lao Army offensive and to exert pressure on the occupational forces of the People's Army of Vietnam, better known as the NVA. A company-sized element of Army Special Forces and Montagnard commandos known as the Hatchet Force of the Military Assistance Command. Vietnam Studies and Observation Group, better known as MACV-SOG, conducted the operation. Out of CCC, Command and Control Central. Nearly 30 years later, CNN and Time magazine jointly developed an investigative report that was both broadcast and published in June of 1998 about Operation Tailwind. The TV segment was produced by April Oliver, Jack Smith, Pam Hill, and others. It was narrated by none other than Peter Arnett, noted for war reporting, who had received a 1966 Pulitzer Prize for his work from Vietnam and who had worked with CNN for 18 years. Entitled Valley of Death, the report claimed that U.S. air support had used sarin nerve gas against opponents and that other war crimes had been committed by U.S. forces during Tailwind. In response, the Pentagon conducted an investigation, as did CNN. The news organization together ultimately retracted their report and fired the producers responsible. Two sued CNN in a challenge of their dismissals and reached an out-of-court settlement with the network, meaning the network paid them off. After being reprimanded by CNN, Arnett resigned from the organization. Don't worry about Peter. He came out of that okay. He moved over to NBC and continued his reporting. Now let's take a look at the actual operation. During the late 1970s, the overall U.S.-supported military effort in the covert war in the Kingdom of Laos was floundering. Operation Gauntlet, a multi-battalion Royal Lao Army offensive intended to protect Paksong and the strategic Bolovens Plateau, was failing. They appealed to Headquarters Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observation Group in Saigon, requesting aid from the highly classified unit. Specifically, they asked for a unit to enter near Chavon and disrupt NVA defenses. Colonel John Sadler, SOG's commander, agreed to undertake the mission, but none of his cross-border reconnaissance teams had ever operated so deep in Laos, and the target area was 20 miles beyond the unit's authorized area of operations. The mission was launched by 3 platoons of Command and Control Central's Kontum Hatchet Company B and 2 United States Air Force Pathfinder teams. The 110 Montagnards and 16 Americans under the command of Captain Eugene McCarley were lifted from a launch site at Dak To to a landing zone in a valley 60 miles to the west near Chavon. The distance to the target was so great that the men were lifted by 3 United States Marine Corps Sikorsky CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters from HMH 463, escorted by 12 U.S. Marine and Army Cobra gunships. On the morning of the third day, the Americans overran an NVA bivouac and killed 45 troops. They questioned why the Vietnamese had not fled the area, but members of the Hatchet Force discovered a bunker buried beneath 12 feet of earth. Inside, they found a huge cache of NVA maps and documents. They had overrun the NVA logistical headquarters that controlled all of Laotian Route 165. The forces quickly filled 2 footlockers with the intelligence haul, and the Hatchet Force began to seek a way out. The North Vietnamese were closing in, but McCarley dropped off elements of 3 separate and smaller landing zones, catching the NVA unprepared. Casualties incurred during the operation amounted to 3 Montagnards killed in action and 33 wounded, while all 16 Americans were wounded. 2 CH-53s were shot down during the operation. The efforts of SOG Medic Sergeant Gary Michael Rose were considered critical to the survival of many of the Hatchet Force. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor for his actions. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, which was later upgraded to the Medal of Honor, which President Donald Trump presented to him on October the 23rd, 2017. Apparently, the CNN and Time magazine report on Operation Tailwind was what we know today as fake news. After this happened, both those organizations undertook an internal investigation. New York attorney Floyd Abrams was hired to conduct the investigation for them. they jointly concluded that the journalism of the report was flawed and the report should be publicly retracted, with apologies made to persons and institutions cited in it. It looks like CNN is like a leopard and never changes its spots. It was lying back then when they did the report on Operation Tailwind, and it appears they're still lying today to the public. That's something else that we should conclude from the story about Operation Tailwind. The main thing is that 16 brave Americans, along with their 110 brave Montagnards, went further into Laos than any other American force had been up to that time. They did a good job out there. They eliminated some NVA. They also picked up some excellent intelligence. I have to take my hat off to the Special Forces for having such brave people who will go out on such dangerous missions. I think they deserve more credit than I can give. But right now, I am hereby issuing all the Special Forces people who served in Vietnam an official Vietnam Veteran News Podcast salute for your service. We thank you and we wish you the best. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1696 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these stories. You are cordially invited to come again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?